At LaGuardia Airport in New York, a man walked through the bustling terminal with an air of confidence. He had just wrapped up an important business meeting, one that could shape the future of his company. Dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a leather briefcase, he looked every bit like someone who was used to success. This wasn't his first time traveling for work. He knew how airports worked, from check-in to boarding. But on this particular day, something felt different. As he approached the counter at one of the biggest airlines in the country, he expected everything to go smoothly. After all, he had booked a premium ticket weeks earlier. The flight was part of his routine travels, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet when he stepped up to speak with the airline staff, things took an unexpected turn. Instead of being greeted warmly or asked for his documents, the person behind the counter barely glanced at him. Without explanation, they told him to wait outside. Confusion washed over him. Wait outside? For what? He tried to clarify, explaining politely that he was there to check in for his flight, but the response was dismissive. The staff member muttered something vague about needing clearance for first-class passengers. It didn't make sense. His ticket clearly stated he was flying premium class. Still, he waited, thinking maybe it was some kind of mix-up. But then something caught his attention. Another traveler, a white man wearing casual clothes, not even dressed as formally as he was, walked up to the same counter moments later. Without hesitation, the staff member greeted him cheerfully and began processing his request right away. No questions, no delays, no awkward instructions to wait outside. That's when it hit him. This wasn't about tickets or clearances. This was about something else entirely. Standing there, surrounded by people rushing past him, he felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger bubbled inside him, but so did frustration and sadness. He thought back to other times in his life, when he'd been treated differently because of the color of his skin. Those memories were always painful, but this moment felt sharper somehow. Maybe it was because he was standing in such a public place, where everyone could see what was happening. Or maybe it was because he had worked so hard to get where he was today, to build a career, to earn respect, to prove himself. And yet here he was being judged before anyone even knew his name. He didn't raise his voice or cause a scene. Instead, he stayed calm and collected. He pulled out his boarding pass and ID again, showing them to the staff member. Finally, after several minutes of waiting and trying to explain himself, they allowed him to proceed. But the damage was done. The interaction left a sour taste in his mouth, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been singled out unfairly. As he moved through security and toward his gate, his mind started racing. What could he do about this? Should he let it slide, chalk it up to a bad day, and move on? Or should he take a stand? Not just for himself, but for others who might face similar treatment. By the time he reached his seat on the plane, he still hadn't decided what to do. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be forgotten anytime soon. Little did he know this small incident would set off a chain of events that would change more than just his own life. It would challenge an entire industry and spark conversations across the country. The plane taxied down the runway, lifting into the sky. Outside the window, the cityscape faded into clouds. Inside, though, his thoughts were anything but peaceful. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the screen of his phone. His fingers hovered above the keyboard as he considered what came next. Whatever decision he made, it would have consequences, for the airline, for its customers, and for himself. And deep down, he knew that whatever happened, this was only the beginning. The man sat quietly in his seat on the plane, replaying the scene at the check-in counter over and over in his mind. He couldn't believe it had happened. Not just because of how unfair it felt, but because it reminded him of all the times he'd been treated differently in the past. Growing up, he'd learned early on that life wasn't always fair. But as an adult, especially after achieving so much success, he thought those days were behind him. He had worked hard to build a reputation, to earn respect, and to prove himself in industries where people like him weren't always given a chance. And yet, here he was, being told to wait outside like he didn't belong. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, he glanced around at the other passengers. Some were scrolling through their phones, others reading books or listening to music. Everyone seemed relaxed, completely unaware of what he was feeling inside. To them, he probably looked like any other traveler, a businessman heading home after a long day. They didn't know the storm brewing in his mind. He thought about the staff member who had dismissed him so casually. Had they even looked at his ticket? Did they assume he couldn't afford premium class based solely on the color of his skin? It wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating. He had faced discrimination before, sure, but this time felt different. Maybe it was because it happened in such a public setting, where dozens of people could see how he was treated. Or maybe it was because he knew deep down that nothing would change unless someone took a stand. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He remembered the first time he realized the world saw him differently. Back then, he didn't have the words to describe it. He just knew something wasn't right. Over the years, he'd learned to navigate these situations with grace, choosing not to let bitterness take root. But today, sitting on this plane, he wondered if staying silent was really the best option. Wasn't silence just another way of letting things stay the same? By the time the flight attendant started handing out drinks, he still hadn't come to a decision. Should he file a complaint? Write a strongly worded email? Or should he do something bigger, something that would force the airline to pay attention? The idea lingered in the back of his mind, growing stronger with each passing minute. What if he could use his influence to make a statement, one that no one would ignore? It wasn't just about him anymore. He thought about all the people who might be going through similar experiences every single day. How many others had been told to wait outside, being or ignored, or treated poorly simply because of how they looked? Every year, millions of travelers pass through airports like LaGuardia, trusting airlines to treat them fairly. Yet stories like his proved that trust wasn't always deserved. If he stayed quiet, nothing would change. But if he spoke up, if he acted boldly, maybe, just maybe, he could spark a conversation that needed to happen. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, he pulled out his phone again. His fingers hovered over the screen as he considered his next move. He opened a draft email, staring at the blank space where the words should go. Writing a message wouldn't be enough, he realized. Airlines received complaints all the time, and most of them ended up forgotten in some corporate inbox. No, this required something more drastic, something that would grab their attention and force them to listen. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Just hours earlier, he had been focused on expanding his company's partnership with this very airline. Now, he found himself questioning whether working with them was worth it. His company provided cutting-edge technology that powered key systems for the airline, everything from customer service chatbots to predictive maintenance tools. Without his software, the airline would struggle to operate efficiently. Stranding thousands of passengers and costing millions of dollars in losses wasn't something they could easily brush off. But was he willing to go there? Could he justify disrupting so many lives just to make a point? The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be backlash, criticism, and possibly legal consequences. People might call him selfish or reckless. But he also knew that sometimes making noise was the only way to bring about real change. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly, glowing softly in the sunlight. For a brief second, he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to take action, to send that email, to pull the plug, to watch the ripple effects spread across the industry. Would it work? Would it matter? Or would it all be for nothing? When the flight attendant approached with a tray of snacks, he politely declined, barely noticing her presence. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the possibilities ahead. By the time the captain announced they were beginning their descent, he still hadn't made up his mind, but one thing was clear. Whatever choice he made, it would define not just his future, but the future of countless others who had ever felt invisible in moments like this. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, he took a deep breath. The hum of engines slowed, and the cabin came alive with the rustle of bags and the click of seatbelts unbuckling. Passengers around him stood up, eager to disembark and get on with their day. But he remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the email draft on his phone. With a mix of determination and nerves, he hit send. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The email was sent. Just like that, a single click set off a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The man sat back in his seat for a moment, heart pounding as the reality of what he had just done sank in. He wasn't just any traveler. He was someone who understood the inner workings of technology and how it kept companies running smoothly, or brought them to a grinding halt. His company's software powered critical systems for the airline, from customer service chatbots to flight scheduling tools. Without it, the airline would struggle to function. As passengers around him gathered their belongings and filed out of the plane, he stayed seated for a few extra seconds, trying to steady his nerves. What had started as a frustrating encounter at the check-in counter had now escalated into something much bigger. He knew the impact of his actions wouldn't be immediate. It would take time for the airline systems to freeze up. But when it happened, there would be no turning back. Walking through the terminal, he couldn't help but notice the normalcy of everything around him. People were chatting on their phones, scrolling through social media, or rushing to catch connecting flights. No one seemed to realize that chaos was about to unfold. He wondered how long it would take before the first signs of trouble appeared. Would it start with delayed flights, canceled reservations, or maybe angry customers stuck in endless phone queues unable to get answers? By the time he reached baggage claim, his phone buzzed with notifications. At first, it was just a trickle, a few missed calls and messages from colleagues asking if everything was okay. But soon, the floodgates opened. Calls poured in from executives at the airline, panicked voices demanding to know what was going wrong. One message stood out. "Your system is down. We need you to fix this immediately." He read the words without responding right away. Fix it? After what they put him through? The thought made him shake his head. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding them accountable for treating people unfairly. Still, he didn't want to jump the gun. Before making any decisions, he needed to see how far-reaching the effects would be. Back at home later that evening, he turned on the news. It didn't take long for reports to surface about widespread disruptions across the airline's operations. Passengers stranded at gates, flights delayed indefinitely, and chaos spreading like wildfire. Social media lit up with complaints from frustrated travelers. Some shared screenshots of error messages popping up on the airline's app. Others posted videos of overwhelmed staff members struggling to assist confused customers. The hashtag #Skyflyfail trended within hours, drawing attention not just from regular users but also from journalists and industry experts. Watching all of this unfold, he felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing his plan come to life. For years, big corporations had brushed off complaints about discrimination, dismissing them as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Now here was proof that when you hit them where it hurt, in their profits, they couldn't ignore you anymore. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the guilt of knowing innocent people were caught in the crossfire. Families trying to reunite, business travelers missing important meetings, vacationers losing precious time. They weren't part of his fight, yet they were paying the price. His phone continued to ring non-stop, each call more urgent than the last. Executives begged him to restore the system, promising to investigate what went wrong and ensure it never happened again. Lawyers threatened legal action, warning him about potential consequences. Reporters left voicemails requesting interviews, eager to uncover the story behind the sudden outage. Through it all, he remained calm, listening carefully but saying little. He wasn't ready to negotiate, not yet. Instead, he spent the night drafting another email. This time, it wasn't just a shutdown command. It was a list of demands. If the airline wanted their systems back online, they would need to publicly apologize for the discriminatory treatment he experienced. They would also need to commit to meaningful changes, things like mandatory diversity training for employees, transparent investigations into past incidents, and the creation of a task force dedicated to addressing systemic issues within the company. These weren't unreasonable requests, he told himself. In fact, they should have been standard practices all along. Before sending the email, he paused to reflect on what he was doing. Was this the right way to bring about change? Would people understand why he took such drastic measures? He thought about the countless others who might benefit from this moment, if it forced the airline to confront its biases and make real progress. He thought about the young kids watching the news, seeing someone stand up against injustice even when it meant facing criticism. Maybe, just maybe, this could inspire others to speak up too. With a deep breath, he pressed send. Almost instantly, his phone began vibrating again. This time the tone of the messages shifted. Instead of threats and pleas, there were acknowledgments, grudging ones, but acknowledgments nonetheless. The airline's CEO personally called, apologizing for the incident and agreeing to discuss his demands further. It was a small victory, but it gave him hope that things could improve. As the night wore on, he finally allowed himself to relax for a moment. Sitting alone in his living room, he scrolled through the endless stream of updates online. Comment sections filled with debates about accountability, privilege, and the power dynamics between corporations and consumers. Journalists speculated about who was behind the outage, some praising the mysterious figure while others condemned the disruption. Amidst all the noise, one thing was clear: the world was paying attention. For the first time since the ordeal began, he smiled. Whatever happened next, he knew he had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Change wouldn't come overnight, but this was a start. A bold, messy, imperfect step toward a better future. And as exhausting as the day had been, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, he let himself rest, knowing he had taken a stand that mattered. The next morning, the man woke up to a world in chaos. News outlets were ablaze with updates about the airline's massive system failure. Reporters stood outside airports, microphones in hand, interviewing frustrated passengers who had been stranded for hours. Some travelers vented their anger on live TV, while others shared tearful stories of missed connections and ruined plans. Social media feeds were flooded with posts from people demanding answers. Why is this happening? Was the question everyone seemed to be asking. He turned on the news, sipping his coffee as he watched the drama unfold. The anchors speculated endlessly about what could have caused such a widespread outage. Was it a cyber attack, a technical glitch, or something else entirely? Analysts weighed in, offering theories but no concrete answers. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to respond, issuing vague statements about unexpected technical difficulties and assuring customers that they were working around the clock to fix the problem. But behind closed doors, executives knew exactly what was going on, and they weren't happy. As he scrolled through his phone, he saw countless messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Some praised him for taking a bold stand against discrimination, calling him a hero. Others criticized him, accusing him of being selfish or reckless. One commenter wrote, "Sure, the airline messed up, but did you really have to ruin thousands of people's lives to make your point?" That comment stuck with him. He didn't want anyone to think he enjoyed causing pain. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Still, he couldn't deny the collateral damage his actions had caused. Families separated, vacations canceled, business deals postponed, all because of his decision to shut down the system. But then there were the other voices, the ones that reminded him why he had done this in the first place. A young woman tweeted, "If shutting down an airline is what it takes to get them to treat black customers fairly, then I support it 100%. Another person posted, "Finally, someone is holding these companies accountable. Maybe now they'll stop pretending racism doesn't exist." These comments gave him strength. They reminded him that while his actions might not be perfect, they were necessary. Sometimes shaking things up was the only way to force change. By mid-morning, the situation at the airline had reached a boiling point. Thousands of flights had been delayed or canceled, leaving airports packed with angry passengers. Flight attendants and ground staff worked tirelessly to manage the chaos, but without access to their usual tools. They were fighting a losing battle. Pilots couldn't receive updated weather reports, baggage handlers struggled to track luggage, and customer service lines were overwhelmed with calls. The entire operation was grinding to a halt, and the financial losses were mounting by the hour. Back at the airline's headquarters, panic reigned supreme. Executives gathered in emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Lawyers warned of potential lawsuits from disgruntled customers. Public relations teams brainstormed ways to control the narrative before the bad press spiraled further out of control. And IT specialists frantically analyzed the system, searching for clues about what had gone wrong. Despite their best efforts, they were powerless to restore functionality without his help. Finally, late in the afternoon, the airline's CEO made a desperate move. He personally called the man again, this time bypassing layers of assistants and intermediaries. When the ICO phone rang, he hesitated for a moment before answering. On the other end of the line, the CEO sounded exhausted but determined. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. "This can't continue." The man listened carefully, letting the CEO explain the extent of the damage. Thousands of flights disrupted, millions of dollars lost, countless passengers stranded. The CEO admitted that the company had made mistakes, that the discriminatory treatment the man experienced should never have happened, but he also pleaded for understanding, emphasizing the human cost of the ongoing disruption. "We're willing to make changes," the CEO said. "Just tell us what you want us to do." For a moment, the man considered hanging up. Part of him wanted to let the chaos play out longer, to ensure the airline truly understood the gravity of its actions. But another part of him recognized that prolonging the outage would only hurt more innocent people. He had already sent his list of demands earlier: public apologies, diversity training, systemic reforms, but now he needed to decide whether to push harder or start negotiating. After a long pause, he responded. "I'm listening," he said simply. It was enough to keep the conversation going. Over the next hour, they discussed specifics: timelines for implementing reforms, transparency in addressing past incidents, and commitments to hold employees accountable for discriminatory behavior. The CEO agreed to everything, promising to follow through if the systems were restored immediately. When the call ended, the man sat quietly for a while, staring at the wall. He knew this was just the beginning. Restoring the system wouldn't magically erase years of bias or solve every issue overnight, but it was a step, a significant one, in the right direction. With a deep breath, he opened his laptop and typed a single command. Within minutes, the airline systems began coming back online. At first, the recovery was slow. Ground crews cautiously resumed operations, double-checking data to ensure accuracy. Customer service representatives started answering calls again, apologizing profusely to irate travelers. Pilots received updated flight plans, and planes gradually returned to the skies. By evening, the worst of the chaos had subsided, though the ripple effects would linger for days. As night fell, the man stepped outside for some fresh air. The streets were quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past 24 hours. He thought about everything that had transpired: the frustration, the anger, the courage it took to take a stand. He thought about the people whose lives had been disrupted and the lessons they might take away from this experience. Most of all, he thought about the future. What would happen next? Would the airline actually follow through on its promises? Would this moment spark broader conversations about fairness and accountability? Standing under the stars, he allowed himself a small smile. Change was never easy, and it rarely came quickly. But sometimes all it took was one person willing to say, "Enough." For better or worse, he had done just that. And as he walked back inside, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them head-on. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The man had restored the airline systems, but the story was far from over. News of the outage continued to dominate headlines, and public opinion remained divided. Some people praised him for standing up against discrimination, while others criticized him for disrupting so many lives. Social media was a battleground of opinions, with hashtags like Trying Justice for Travelers and Planning Accountability Matters trending side by side. Amidst all the noise, one thing was clear: the airline couldn't ignore what had happened anymore. Executives from the airline reached out multiple times, eager to show they were serious about making changes. They scheduled meetings, sent emails, and even flew representatives to meet him in person. At first, he was skeptical. Promises were easy to make, but actions spoke louder than words. He wasn't about to let them off the hook just because they said sorry. So he set strict conditions for moving forward. Every promise they made would need to be backed by tangible steps and deadlines. If they failed to deliver, he warned, the consequences would be severe. The negotiations weren't easy. Both sides came to the table with strong feelings. On one side, the airline wanted to repair its reputation and minimize further damage. On the other, he refused to compromise on fairness and accountability. Hours turned into days as they hammered out details. Would diversity training be mandatory for all employees? Yes. Would there be independent oversight to ensure reforms were implemented properly? Absolutely. Would victims of past discrimination receive acknowledgement and compensation? That was still up for debate. During one particularly tense meeting, an airline executive argued that some of his demands were too extreme. "We're trying to fix things," the executive said, frustration creeping into their voice. "But we can't rewrite years of policies overnight." The man leaned forward, his expression calm but firm. "You didn't create this mess overnight either," he replied. "It took years of ignoring complaints, brushing off concerns, and pretending racism doesn't exist within your company. Now you have a chance to do better, don't waste it." That moment shifted the tone of the conversation. The executives realized he wasn't going anywhere. Not until real progress was made. Slowly but surely, they began agreeing to his terms. By the end of the week, they had outlined a comprehensive plan. Public apologies would be issued, not just to him, but to every customer who had ever been mistreated. Mandatory diversity training programs would roll out across all levels of the organization. A task force would be created to investigate systemic issues and propose solutions. And perhaps most importantly, an independent auditor would monitor the airline's progress, ensuring transparency and accountability. When the airline held a press conference to announce these changes, the CEO stood before cameras, looking visibly uncomfortable but sincere. "What happened was unacceptable," the CEO admitted, addressing the nation. "Not only did we fail one of our valued customers, but we also failed countless others who may have experienced similar treatment. We are committed to doing better, starting today." The apology sparked mixed reactions. Some praised the airline for taking responsibility, while others dismissed the statement as too little, too late. But for the man at the center of it all, the apology wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning. He knew apologies meant nothing without action. Over the following weeks, he stayed involved, working closely with advocacy groups and watchdog organizations to hold the airline accountable. Regular updates were shared with the public, showing exactly what steps were being taken and how much progress had been made. Meanwhile, the incident sparked broader conversations about discrimination. In the travel industry, other airlines started reviewing their own policies, realizing they weren't immune to similar controversies. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for industry-wide reforms, calling for standardized practices to prevent racial profiling and bias. Journalists wrote articles exploring the roots of systemic racism in corporate America, highlighting stories of everyday people who had faced similar injustices. For the first time in a long time, the issue of discrimination in public spaces was front and center, and people were paying attention. As the weeks turned into months, the man found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The initial outrage had died down, replaced by quieter, more meaningful discussions about how to create lasting change. He attended conferences, gave interviews, and collaborated with experts to develop tools and resources for combating discrimination. His company played a key role in this effort, using its technology to promote inclusivity and fairness. For example, They developed algorithms designed to detect patterns of bias in customer interactions, helping companies identify areas where they needed to improve. Despite the progress, he knew the fight was far from over. Discrimination wasn't something that could be solved overnight or even in a lifetime. It required constant vigilance, ongoing education, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But seeing the impact of his actions gave him hope. People were talking, companies were listening. Change, however slow, was happening. One evening, as he sat on his balcony watching the sunset, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the humiliating encounter at the check-in counter to the chaotic aftermath of the system shutdown, every step had been difficult, but worth it. He had started this fight alone, fueled by anger and determination. But along the way, he had inspired others to join him, creating a movement bigger than himself. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from a stranger, a young woman who had read about his story online. "Thank you," she wrote. "Your courage gives me hope that things can get better." He smiled, saving the message to his favorites folder. Moments like these reminded him why he had done what he did. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about making a difference, even if it was just for one person. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight he let himself rest, knowing he had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after he was gone. Months had passed since the incident at the airport, and life had settled into a new rhythm for the man who had dared to challenge one of the biggest airlines in the country. The chaos he had caused was no longer headline news, but its effects lingered in ways that went far beyond canceled flights and angry tweets. Conversations about fairness, accountability, and systemic change had taken root, sprouting into something bigger than anyone could have anticipated, including him. The airline, once resistant to admitting fault, had transformed under the weight of public scrutiny and internal reflection. True to their promises, they rolled out diversity training programs across all departments. Employees attended workshops where they learned not just about racial bias, but also about empathy, communication, and the importance of treating every customer with dignity. The task force he had insisted on creating became a cornerstone of the company's reform efforts, conducting audits, gathering feedback from passengers, and proposing solutions to prevent future incidents. Independent auditors regularly reviewed their progress, ensuring transparency and holding them accountable. But what struck the man most was how these changes rippled outward. Other airlines began implementing similar measures, realizing they couldn't afford to ignore the growing demand for inclusivity. Advocacy groups gained momentum, using his story as a rallying cry to push for broader reforms in the travel industry. Journalists wrote follow-up pieces highlighting improvements or lack thereof across different companies. Even government regulators took notice, introducing guidelines aimed at addressing discrimination in public spaces. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but it was undeniable. Things were shifting. For the man himself, life had changed in unexpected ways. He went from being relatively unknown outside his industry to becoming a household name. People recognized him on the street, stopping him to share their own stories of discrimination or simply to thank him for standing up. Social media flooded with messages from strangers who said his actions gave them hope. Some even called him a hero, though he never saw himself that way. To him, he was just someone who refused to stay silent when silence felt like complicity. Despite the praise, he remained grounded. Fame wasn't something he sought, nor did it define him. What mattered most was the impact of his decision, the tangible differences it made in people's lives. He traveled less frequently now, choosing instead to focus on initiatives that promoted equality and justice. His company launched a nonprofit arm dedicated to combating discrimination in public spaces, funding projects that ranged from educational campaigns to tech tools designed to detect bias in customer service interactions. They partnered with schools, businesses, and community organizations to spread awareness and foster dialogue. One of the most rewarding aspects of this journey was meeting others who had been inspired by his actions. At conferences and events, he connected with activists, entrepreneurs, and everyday people working tirelessly to create a more equitable world. A young woman shared how she started a petition after hearing his story, demanding better treatment for marginalized communities at airports. A father described teaching his son about courage and standing up for what's right, using the man's experience as an example. These moments reminded him why he had taken such a bold step in the first place, not for himself, but for those who needed a voice. Of course, not everyone agreed with what he had done. Critics continued to argue that shutting down an airline systems was too extreme, pointing to the inconvenience caused to thousands of travelers. Some accused him of seeking attention or exploiting the situation for personal gain. He didn't shy away from these criticisms. Instead, he addressed them head-on. In interviews and speeches, he acknowledged the disruption his actions had caused, but emphasized that sometimes drastic measures were necessary to spark meaningful change. "I didn't do this to hurt innocent people," he often said. "I did it because I wanted to show that we can't keep pretending racism doesn't exist. Ignoring the problem only makes it worse." Over time, the criticism softened, replaced by grudging respect, even from those who initially opposed him. Many realized that while his methods may have been unconventional, they forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Change, rarely, came without resistance, and his willingness to face backlash head-on inspired others to speak up too. As the months turned into a year, the man found himself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in the airline industry, but within himself. He had entered this journey driven by anger and frustration, but he emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. Fighting for justice wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but it was worth it. Every small victory, every policy change, every person empowered to stand up against discrimination reminded him that progress was possible. One evening, he sat in his living room flipping through photos on his phone. There were pictures from recent events, panels he'd spoken at, rallies he'd attended, meetings with advocacy groups. Among them was a photo of a young boy holding a sign that read, "Be brave like him." It brought tears to his eyes. He thought back to his own childhood, when he first realized the world saw him differently. Back then, he hadn't known how to process those feelings, let alone channel them into action. But now, seeing the next generation inspired to fight for fairness filled him with pride. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from a colleague updating him on the latest developments with the nonprofit. Progress was steady, though challenges remained. Discrimination wasn't something you could erase overnight. It required constant effort, patience, and resilience. Still, he felt hopeful. The seeds he had planted were growing, spreading roots deeper than he ever imagined. As he put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. Outside, the city buzzed with life, cars honking, people chatting, the hum of activity continuing late into the night. Inside, it was calm. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Not because everything was fixed, far from it, but because he knew he had done his part. He had stood up, spoken out, and sparked a movement that would carry on long after he was gone. He smiled softly, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, he let himself rest knowing he had made a difference, and sometimes that was enough.